If you've ever raised a seed round, pitched a VC, or joined a startup accelerator, you're part of a system that Bill Reichert helped build. Welcome back to Startup Nation. I'm Meng Fei. Today, I'm talking with Bill Reichert, who is really a legend in the Silicon Valley world. Bill started his software company out of Stanford in the 1980s, back when being a startup founder wasn't so cool or fashionable yet. In 1998, he co-founded Garage Technology Ventures with Guy Kawasaki, where they pioneered this concept of global VCs and open access to what was once a closed venture ecosystem. He also helped create, arguably, the first startup accelerator in the 1990s, and was among the first to popularize terms like seed and pre-seed funding, along with UCLA and Tim Draper. Now, as a partner at Pegasus Tech Ventures, Bill champions open innovation by bridging startups with global corporations through venture as a service model. We chat about how venture capital became what it is today, and Bill's journey through crashing and succeeding in his own startup to creating massively successful ventures, and really what founders need to know today about global markets, corporate partnerships, and the future of innovation. I was also super impressed by how Bill was able to break down pretty complicated concepts to easy to understand and digestible forms, which I think is definitely an important skill in the startup world and beyond, and something I definitely learned from this conversation, among many other things, of course. So excited to share this episode and hope you enjoy. Hi, Bill, and welcome to the podcast. I am honored to have you join me today. You are both a veteran in the entrepreneurship circle as well as the venture circle and have certainly had a very adventurous career. So to start off, I would love to learn a little bit more about your background and how you came to become an entrepreneur as well as an investor.
Well, thank you so much, Meng Fei, for having me on your podcast. I am delighted and honored to be here. How did I get here from there? So the short version is I came out here many years ago to go to Stanford for graduate school. And this was before it was fashionable for Stanford grad students to start their own companies. But while I was a grad student, I started a software company with a buddy of mine. And that got me into Silicon Valley. It got me hooked on entrepreneurship. And it got me going in this whole innovation ecosystem thing. So I'm 20-something. I started a software company. I'm going to date myself. It was way, way back in the 80s. So we were one of the first application development shops for the PC. And so our big idea was that there wasn't enough good software for enterprises on the PC. And I had cut my teeth on enterprise computing when I was at McKinsey and Company before grad school and had all these compute resources. And so I was doing a project for a VC and I said, someone needs to develop software for this PC thing. And he said, why don't you do it, Bill? And I said, no, I'm going to Wall Street. I'm going to do whatever. He said, yeah, come on. I took the entrepreneurship course, wrote the business plan. I figure I'm killing it. I made credit for writing the business plan. Go back to the VC, one call close, and that was it. We were funded. And I thought, God, this VC thing, people say it's tough. It seems pretty easy to me. So then we launched the company. The company takes off like a rocket ship. And then one day, all of a sudden, kablooey. It blows up, crashes and burns. That's a longer story. And at the time, I had just gotten engaged. And so I had to tell my fiance, who at the time thought I was a multi-millionaire, right? And so I had to tell her, all that money that we thought we had on paper, it's all gone. But so the great news is she married me anyway. And then the good news is in Silicon Valley, when you crash and burn, you get to pick yourself up and dust yourself off, and then you spin the story a little bit, and you get to do it again. And so that was my great good fortune. And so I did it again and actually went in and did a restart of a company called The Learning Company. And we wound up taking that public. And so I thought, I know everything there is to know about entrepreneurship now, right? I crashed and burned. I took a company public. What more is there? I jumped into another company which had the coolest technology I had ever seen in my life, and ran that into a brick wall at 500 miles an hour. And, lesson learned, don't fall in love with technology. The important lesson. And then my fourth company, we took that public and I said, okay, let's try something new. And I got together with Guy Kawasaki and a few other people, and we started Garage Technology Ventures, which was designed to be a radically different venture capital firm. So this is 1999. And our big idea was the next big thing is not the internet, which is what everybody else was thinking. The next big thing was global entrepreneurship. And so our big idea was we should open up venture capital to entrepreneurs from around the world. How do you do that? We were the first venture capital firm to take business plans over the internet. So we said to the world, you don't have to be a golfing buddy of some venture capitalist in order to get access to venture capital. Come to us. And so we got 100,000 business plans in the first 2 years. It was insane, but it was a very interesting time. And that's what got me into venture capital. So in any case, in 2.5 years, we funded like 132 or 4 companies. We were arguably the first accelerator. And what never occurred to us is that you could accelerate more than one company at a time. We had a model. We would filter through these 100,000. We took 0.1% of the companies that we reviewed and gave them a small check and then took them to our buddies on Sand Hill Road was the big idea. 91% of all the companies we took on got venture capital funding. It's a success rate that has never been repeated, not by Y Combinator or Techstars or anybody else. But God bless Paul Graham. He figured out a better model of, hey, I can accelerate 400 companies at a time. So in any case, God bless. Fast forward, several years ago, I bumped into Anna Suzeman, who is the founder of Pegasus. Pegasus is another completely different venture capital model. So Pegasus is a global venture capital firm with offices around the world. What we do is we work with multinational corporations that are trying to implement an innovation strategy using the thesis of open innovation, right? And so we partner with multinational corporations and we set up dedicated funds for each one of our corporate partners so that all of their money is going into companies that they precisely are interested in. And so the problem that we solve is most VCs want to pool corporate money into a big fund, and they promise the VCs, oh, don't worry, we're paying attention to your interests, and we'll show you some companies that fit your strategic needs. Well, okay, I love my dear colleagues in the venture capital community, but that generally doesn't work for corporations. So 100% of the money and the time and the startup focus for each one of our funds is focused on their strategic priorities. And that gives much greater alignment in terms of the capital investment, as well as the strategic partnerships. So one of the things that we do is we facilitate collaborations between our portfolio companies and our network of over 40 multinational corporations. So it's a venture capital model with this added twist of bringing a lot more to the table than just capital. So Anis and I merged, and so that's what wound up with me being a general partner here at Pegasus Tech Ventures, and the rest is about to be history.
Super cool career path, Bill. And It's really cool that you guys are kind of the pioneers of really understanding and wanting to bring in global markets from a pretty early period with Garage. And I'd love to understand what was the value that you saw at that time when nobody had really done this before?
I mean, in the 90s, and especially during the bubble, what was happening was pretty much every government on the planet was sending teams to Silicon Valley to figure out this innovation ecosystem thing. And so we partner, at Garage, one of the things we did is we set up offices in such faraway places as Boston and Austin, but we had an office in London, we had an office in Germany, we had an office in Israel. We were working our way around the globe because we were seeing this sort of explosion of interest in innovation, entrepreneurship, venture capital all over the world. And so we were seeing all of these stakeholders saying, hey, how do we get some of this sort of Silicon Valley pixie dust? And so that was the opportunity that we were tapping into, to partner with different players around the world to help them develop their innovation ecosystems and then connect them to Silicon Valley. And so that seemed unique and obvious to us. And the other thing that was part of the Garage model was to be the farm team for Sand Hill Road. So we were funded by Sequoia and Mayfield and Draper Fisher Jurvetson and Silicon Valley Bank and a bunch of other tier one VCs with the idea that they were too big to waste their time on startups. So believe it or not, back then, we were unique because our focus was what was then called seed. Believe it or not. So, and then it was funny because then working with Tim Draper, we were working with UCLA on this new concept called pre-seed. These terms have evolved fairly dramatically over the years to the point where now you can be 2.5 million in revenues and be considered to be seed. Okay, fine, whatever. Pretty soon we're going to have pre-seed, I think, as a category of investment. But that's where we were playing. We were playing at the seed level, and we got all this inbound from the world around universities and governments and angel groups and VCs who were saying, we've got these entrepreneurs here. How do we develop an ecosystem that can help them help us, et cetera, et cetera? That was the energy. That was the energy back then that was extraordinarily exciting, that has now, to say, evolved substantially in the last 20 years.
You were kind of one of the creators in this model of early Silicon Valley and what funding actually meant and looked like during that time periods, and kind of seeing it evolve and continuously being active in this community as well, I think is quite extraordinary, Bill. And I'd love to learn a little bit about how that work translated into the work that you started doing at Pegasus, which does a lot of open innovation. And like you said, has quite a different model. I believe the term was venture capital as a
Right.
service model. Could you talk a little bit about that and the value that you guys saw in having these type of corporate partnerships with startups?
Right. Yeah. So just it is interesting having been around the Valley a long time, and some people look at me and say things like, "You were back then at the creation." I've seen a lot of evolution over the years. I've had lots of time to talk with lots of people about the evolution of venture capital, and including a guy who has been one of our advisors forever and ever, Bill Draper, Tim Draper's dad, who Bill Draper arguably was present at the creation in terms of the creation of venture capital in Silicon Valley. But Silicon Valley existed before there was venture capital in Silicon Valley. And in fact, the first investment capital in Silicon Valley was actually corporate capital. And so the way we think of Pegasus and the role of Pegasus in the venture ecosystem is what we call corporate venture capital 4.0. And corporate venture capital 1.0 was the original when corporations invested in startups the way Beckman Instruments invested in Shockley Labs, or Fairchild invested in Fairchild Semiconductor, Bob Noyce and the gang. And so that was actually more important originally than venture capital. And then venture capital came along and they said, hey, corporations, we're doing the work of finding these startups. Give us your money and then we'll deploy it against these startups. And so Venture Capital 2.0 was investing in venture capital firms who were like professionals at identifying and assessing and filtering and investing in startups and helping them grow. So that was early Silicon Valley venture capital. Then eventually some corporations figured out, hey, we can do that ourselves. And so guys like Intel Capital and then Cisco and then many others said, we're going to create our own venture capital groups inside our corporations because we're tired of putting our money in these VC funds and seeing it invested in things that we don't care about. So if we create our own venture capital firm, then we can make sure we only invest in things that we care about. But one of the problems historically with venture capital firms is that corporate boards don't have a lot of patience for venture capital investing. And so arguably we created or reinvented corporate venture capital 4.0. And the big idea there was to use a venture capital firm architecture, Pegasus Tech Ventures, and create dedicated funds. So we create dedicated funds that are 10-year, plain vanilla, Delaware limited partnerships. And so the deal is, okay, corporation, are you serious about open innovation? Are you serious about tapping into emerging technologies globally to accelerate your own innovation and your own growth? If you are serious, then you're going to make this commitment. And this commitment is a 10-year venture capital fund commitment. And that way, when fluctuations happen in the macro market and the board is anxious about this or that, we've got some resistance or protection against quarterly changes and turnover in sort of corporate staffing. And so it creates a more resilient and persistent commitment to an open innovation strategy. And so that's the big idea behind Pegasus, is to help corporations make these commitments to long-term innovation strategies rather than having teams be subject to the quarterly whims of the stock market in their future roles as corporate investors.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. And that's really great. I had a conversation with Professor Richard Dasher a couple weeks back, actually, and he was saying that one of the challenges to open innovation and working with corporations is that sometimes there is a mismatch in the speed of development between startups as well as these large corporations. And so on a funding level, these corporations have devoted a commitment of 10 years or longer. But on a partnership level, what do you see as some of the challenges and ways to get around these challenges and resolve them so that there could be more productive relationship between corporate and startups?
Exactly. No, and that's one of the other key value propositions of the Pegasus model. So in the sort of startup innovation venture ecosystem, we're a venture capital firm. We're not a corporate, right? And we have venture capital bones and backgrounds, and we work with the startup communities and other investors as a venture capital firm. We then facilitate these corporate partnerships to enable our corporate partners to tap into this innovation and to enable our portfolio companies to get the advantage of those relationships. But the time sequence on that is frequently very different. And we, as a
Really?
venture firm, are this trusted intermediary facilitator. On the one hand, we're socializing our corporate partners on the best way to interact with startups. And again, with all due respect to our dear corporate partners, a lot of corporations are not that good at working with startups. And that's what Richard is referring to. It's not just the time frames, it's also the processes. And for example, typically, this keeps coming up where we're excited around a technology, we see an opportunity for a partnership, and everybody's excited to get going, and okay, let's get going. And then the corporation, their legal department, sends over this 85-page master services agreement. And the startup said, what is this? And so big corporations are used to dealing with vendors that are big corporations, right? At least relatively big corporations. Big corporations are used to beating up their vendors to squeeze every last penny out of their vendors, right? So that doesn't work with startups. So we have spent a lot of time coaching and educating our corporate partners on how to work with startups. So we actually we've created something we call Pegasus University for workshops to help our corporate partners with this whole process of open innovation and working with startups. So they all read the book on open innovation, but it's very different to understand the theory and to actually execute the practice. And so that's part of the role we play with our corporates. And then on the other side with the startups, protecting them at some level from some of the pain and suffering that a corporate partnership can sometimes lead to. So we try to be that balanced, trusted intermediary between the two to the benefit of both. So we're trying to create value for our corporates, and we're also trying to create value for our portfolio companies. And so that it's a win-win. And if it's a win for them and a win for startups, then it's a win for us.
It's like using your robust understanding of both corporates and also of startups to become that middleman and communicate on both sides and kind of heal some of those misunderstandings while also giving practical advice through like Pegasus University to corporates and also to startups on how to better partner with each other because you understand the practices and the challenges from both sides. Startup World Cup, could you talk a little bit more about that, Bill?
Sure. Thank you for touching on that. So yeah, when I first met Anis, he had seen that Garage, we ran a program called World Cup for Startups. And the big idea for that was all these international entrepreneurs who come to Silicon Valley. We got Microsoft to sponsor this program to compete against each other, a tongue-in-cheek global competition. And when Anna said, hey, Bill, I want to run a Startup World Cup, I said, okay, fine. And he said, no, I want to run it around the world. And I said, that's insane. That'd be crazy expensive. And Anna said, no, Bill, you don't get it. We're going to have other people pay. We've heard this before, right? The big idea of Startup World Cup is what we found is in every innovation ecosystem that we talk to around the world, they'd love to plug in to Silicon Valley. And pretty much every ecosystem around the world has something like a pitch competition. And so, what we've done is we've found all these partners around the world and we've said, hey, let's partner under the brand Startup World Cup. And you tell your entrepreneurs in your region, hey, come compete for the local championship. And the winner gets to go to Silicon Valley to compete for a $1 million grand prize. So we wanted to put a stake in the ground that said, this is the richest competition on the planet in terms of the grand prize. Little did we know how it would explode in terms of the number of competitions we were doing. First year we did 15, plus or minus. And then last year we did over 100 regional competitions. So yeah. So when we started, we were doing it in our spare time. And that did not work out all that well. But as it exploded, we built a team that is dedicated to running it and now is running it as a professional program. But it has now become the number one startup competition on the planet. It is the biggest and richest startup competition on the planet. And it's one of those things that every once in a while, right, in life, things happen that are easy, right? Where you have an idea, you plant a seed, and it sprouts and grows like a whatever. And that's what the Startup World Cup. It has just exceeded all of our imaginations in terms of how rapidly it's grown, how big it's become, how many entrepreneurs we get, how many investors we get, how much media we get. It's been extraordinary. So to that end, by the way, for anybody who's listening, go to startupworldcup.io and check out to see when the regional competition near you is happening, because you should be able to throw a rock wherever you are on the planet and hit a Startup World Cup competition. But we're actually running the Silicon Valley regional competition on May 1st here at the Computer History Museum. So, Mengfei, you are invited to come. Please join us. I'll sneak you in, okay?
I would love to come. It's really cool because I think the market needs something like this, right? That's why it's really been able to explode in the short amount of time. And it really gives a platform and a space for entrepreneurs and investors to congregate, and global entrepreneurs and global investors to come together as well.
And that was the big, I mean, again, the extension of what I said before, that entrepreneurship and innovation is a global phenomenon. It is not just Silicon Valley, and it's not just US, in spite of some of the stuff that's going on now.
Well, that brings us to a perfect transition, Bill, to the next kind of area that I'd love to get your insights on, which is there's a lot of crazy things that's happening in the government, particularly the US government right now. How does that impact the way that Pegasus is run and the investments that Pegasus is currently looking at?
At a fundamental level, we're long-term investors. We're not short-term investors, right? At a fundamental level, what we want to tap into are trends in technology and business models and corporate and consumer and other users that are inevitable in terms of things are going that way. Electrification is inevitable. We're going to see a transition in our transportation systems. Some aspects of smart around smart factories and smart homes and smart healthcare are inevitable. So the application of AI and other tools and software to make things more automated and smarter, those things are inevitable, no matter what happens with all this other stuff. But at the margin now, we have to have these conversations about, okay, particularly if you're a hardware company, what is your supply chain? How does that work? At the moment, one of the open questions is, in both health tech and climate tech, a whole bunch of grant money that used to be flowing reasonably well is very questionable now. And where are you in terms of grants that you've already received and grants that you're applying for and sort of dependency on those? So these are questions that now we look at somewhat differently than we did a year ago because of what's going on in DC. And then in terms of key trends, I don't think the venture capital community at this point is broadly interested in funding reshoring activities. I don't see venture capital funding the next steel mill in the United States. So it'll be interesting to see the roles of the different players in the sort of global economy transition that we're going through And what does it mean in terms of where are we going to see the best opportunities for return on investment in a somewhat different global model?
I'm curious to get your thoughts, Bill, on defense, because since this administration, there's been a lot of discussions on the future of defense, and there's also been a lot more discussions within Silicon Valley on defense tech as well. Would love to get your general thoughts and where you think it's headed.
Yeah, no, they sort of the two sectors that weren't historically naturally venture capital sectors that have emerged over the last several years, it's not new with this administration, are space tech and defense tech. And frequently there's an intersection between the two. Not always, but frequently there is an intersection between the two. And God bless In-Q-Tel. They've been around forever and ever, and they've done pretty well. They always had this sort of dual use framework, which said, we're not focused on pure play defense tech. We want technologies that can be commercially successful as well as useful in the defense and intelligence sector. So it's not new, but it has reached a level of visibility in just the last few years, thanks to SpaceX. Full disclosure, we happen to be investors in SpaceX. We were very fortunate to get into SpaceX several years ago. And God bless, it's an amazing company, technology, model, vision. So in terms specifically or more narrowly in defense tech, there's no question that venture capital now sees that there's a model for investing in defense tech that addresses this fundamental failure of the defense contractor industry to be at all agile and effective. And so the contractors blame the Defense Department blames the contractors, whatever. So you got some entrepreneurs who are stepping in and saying, let's stop pointing fingers. I'm going to figure out a way to build listening systems and communication systems and other systems for the military that are faster, more efficient, cheaper. I can get to market in a shorter period of time. And that's the history of venture capital, which is that if a big company tries to implement a novel technology, the reality is the big company can't afford to make a mistake. Small companies, startups can afford to make a mistake, right? And so I was talking to one big company about implementing this new technology, and their comment was, if we tried to implement this new technology, because of our corporate processes and corporate reputations, we have to launch with 99.99% reliability. Right? We're not going to launch something that is in 99.99, at least 4 nines, right? A startup can build an MVP, get it out to market, and build something that is better, faster, and cheaper than a corporation. For this fundamental, it's not exactly the innovator's dilemma. It's not exactly Clayton Christensen. It's a different structural problem between corporations and startups. And there have been a few folks who've seen this opportunity to play in defense around, particularly because smart is a critical component of the next generation of defense technologies. And Silicon Valley is pretty good at smart. And so there's an interesting competitive advantage that is sort of Silicon Valley mindset entrepreneurs have in developing new defense technologies that the big contractors don't have. Now, the big contractors have a huge advantage in terms of getting to and through the Defense Department. And so what you're going to see is the startups working with the contractors to facilitate that process. I think that's what's going to happen. Very similar to what in fintech, 10 years ago, everybody said, in 10 years, the banks will all be gone. They're all dinosaurs. They'll all be gone. No. The thanks to a whole bunch of obvious issues around regulatory and around confidence and reputation, the big banks have a lot of staying power. And the startups realize, geez, the best way for me to get to market is to partner with the enemy. And all the neobanks, all the challenger banks, their back end is actually the legacy banks for the most part. So I think you're going to see that on the defense tech side. The Lockheeds, the Martin Marietas, the Boeings are your pathway to winning these defense contracts. And in some cases, Anduril has been impressive in terms of their own ability to get straight to the Defense Department. But I think, the bottom line, yes, it is an emerging and it will be a significant growing sector of venture capital. It won't be a huge piece of it in the same way that space tech is a growing component